Chapter 2. Madison took stock of Dawson Creek Ranch, even as she let her embarrassment at Maisie's comments cool. Annabelle came around and flipped her blonde top-knot ponytail over her shoulder and headed for the back hatch to open it so she could get her bags. Danica followed, clicking her tongue. Madison watched the handsome cowboy disappear into a stable as Maisie went to the main house to grab the key to their cabin. Unease swirled in her gut. She'd already spent hours in the truck with her friends on the way here. Now they'd have to settle into the cabin before supper. Her life at home was so quiet, alone. Just the thought of sitting down to a meal with so much fuss and people had her wanting to hide. The cabin in the brochure had a small kitchen. Perhaps she could just eat her meals in the room, though Danica might not let her get away with that. Madison dangled the keys. "We're in, ladies. So, Madison, that cowpoke sure thought you were something else." Maisie snapped her gum again as she lugged the largest rolling suitcase in creation toward the cabin. "You should have gone to find him again. We could have used his help moving all this stuff." Madison's own bag looked like a carry-on compared to Maisie's. Danica fell into step next to her. "You okay?" she whispered. Nope, she was decidedly not okay. But none of these ladies would ever understand. They had lives. Danica even had a husband and kids. How could she ever tell them without offending them that she desperately needed the quiet of time spent alone? It wasn't personal, just a need, as important to her as breathing. "I get it, you know. I get nervous traveling too, and I miss my husband already." Danica kept her voice low and slowed her pace so they were a couple yards behind the other two. "If you need a minute to chill, there's like hundreds of acres here for you to explore." Madison let a sigh escape her lungs, like breathing out foul air, then took in a breath slowly. Even though everywhere she looked there were people, there had to be a place on the ranch where she could go and just refresh her soul. Then she could write. Then she could pretend to be human and interact with others. Until she found herself drained again. "Thank you," she choked. "I'm so glad you came." Danica barked a laugh. "I am too. I needed this time away. The muse has been sorely stifled with the kids at home from school." Maisie and Annabelle got the door open and flung it wide, propping it open with a chair from inside. They lugged in their huge designer luggage. If Danica and Madison didn't hurry, there wouldn't be a single bit of storage space left for anyone else's clothes. Danica adjusted the strap to her bag on her shoulder. "You go claim your bunk, then we can find something to eat." Madison shook her head. Nope, she couldn't wait that long to find peace. Her insides were already sluggish. "I'm not hungry. I'll put my bag on my bed, then me and my phone are going to go take some pictures." I still can't believe what Maisie said to Randall. She treated him like he wasn't even human. Danica nodded. To her, he isn't. He's just another character in one of her books. Life is a story to her, and it has little depth. She's nice. Her help in marketing would be good for you, but be careful. You don't want to be too like her, and don't compare yourself. Your life and goals aren't hers. Madison had never realized Danica had been hesitant with any of the other ladies in The Four. She apparently needed to pay better attention. Danica had always chatted with her, and maybe that made it seem like she'd been friends with everyone. Maisie unzipped her rolling zebra print monstrosity and sighed deeply as she began pulling items out. "There are some things I just can't live without." She reached into her bag, then snuggled a pair of heels that would make her about as tall as a Clydesdale. It looked like she'd brought her whole wardrobe bundled in one bag, but Madison knew better. Maisie loved clothes and would probably wear about 3 different outfits every day. She would be the diva. If any of the guests figured out who they were this week, it would be because Maisie would flaunt it. On cue, Maisie pulled a stack of books from the bottom of her bag and laid them on the bed. Just in case. Her sing-song voice dared anyone to disagree. She was the marketer. Why would she give up the chance to meet new readers? Madison had known it in her heart before she'd ever left, but it was just too much. She bit her lip, then let it slip out on a sigh. This was supposed to be a retreat. For writing. Not marketing, not sales, not researching romance, but writing. I thought we were only writers this week, that we were to leave our pen names at home. Maisie rolled her blue eyes with her perfect sweeping eyeliner making her look somewhat cat-like. Never miss a sales opportunity. I'm here to write, to mingle with some hot hero material, and to turn as many of these bored housewives into Rain Lovelace fans as possible. She reached into her bag and pulled out a black silk negligee with blue ribbon trim matching her hair and eyes flawlessly. Oh, perfect. Madison closed her eyes to keep from rolling them. Don't act like you wouldn't sell to a fan of Desiree Scarlett if given the chance. You don't make it to the top without marketing everywhere. Maybe that was her problem. She'd stopped marketing every chance she got. Her fear of being in front of people kept her from release parties, interviews, even her social media profile was a chest picture of a hot guy from one of her covers. No one would ever know her. Danica cleared her throat. I don't care what you do outside this cabin, but there will be no men in here. This is our space for writing, brainstorming, talking, whatever. I'll be video chatting with my husband every night, and I'm not going to have any men walking around in the background that I have to explain away. Annabelle shrugged one delicate shoulder with a slight sneer. Whatever. It isn't like there aren't plenty of places to go that will be less crowded than this tiny room. She picked up one of Maisie's books and ran her hand over the cover. Before the week is up, we need to talk about a collaboration. Madison grabbed her phone and slipped it into her bag. For months, Annabelle had been begging everyone to do a collaboration. She was the only one independently published, but she was making a good go of it. She just didn't understand it was outside of Madison's contract to write a book-length novel for anyone but her publisher. If only she could just say that. Writing a series with Annabelle would be fun, but Madison's agent and her publisher had already stamped it with a big, fat no. Look, why don't you all get settled? Save me at least one drawer. I need to get a little air. The airplane was cramped, and then it was such a long ride. Why did she always have to jabber on? Couldn't she ever just have the conviction to speak what she thought? Why was it so hard to tell them she needed a few minutes and that would have to be okay? Maisie frowned and tossed a cocktail dress onto her bed. Where in the world would she need that? Whatever. If you miss dinner, it isn't our problem. It isn't like all of us didn't have long flights. And I drove, for crying out loud. Danica laid her hand on Madison's shoulder and nodded for the door. We'll see you after a bit. Madison ducked out the door and took a deep breath. Of horse. She wrinkled her nose. She'd known she was heading to a dude ranch, so how had she not figured out that it wouldn't smell like Coney Island? In fact, it smelled far too much like the ranch where she'd grown up in Kansas. Her great-great-great-grandmother Meg had inherited a cattle ranch from her father. Soon after, her first husband died. Though, after a short courtship, Meg married Jackson and they'd moved from cattle to raising horses. Her brothers all ran the ranch now. 120 or so years later, she'd had very little interest in it. While she'd had to muck out stalls as a child, those were distant memories now. The only reason Maisie would have wanted a writer's retreat at a ranch was that she wrote the occasional steamy western. She could probably write the trip off as research. A huge fence ran all the way up the far side of the drive, and inside were a couple mules. Heat rose into her cheeks as she remembered the cowboy, Randall, had been out there to wave them in and had jumped the fence to welcome them. If she wrote westerns, he'd be a perfect hero. All muscles, broad chest, dusty chaps, a smile that quirked one side of a perfectly tanned face. Even the hat. How in the world did he get a perfect tan with that hat? She chuckled at the rabbit trail only her brain would choose to go. All the other writers in The Four would have talked about his other assets, and she wondered how he got a tan. Well, maybe not Danica. She was a quiet sort, kept to herself even when they chatted online. Madison hadn't really gotten to know her well until they'd started texting. She was private about her life. Since Madison had nothing to share, she didn't pry. Danica never posted her pen name to the group, but since they'd met in a romance writing forum, that part was a given. She didn't ever discuss her work with others. In fact, Madison couldn't even remember Danica doing a book cover reveal in the group. Madison leaned against the fence, resting her foot on the bottom rail, lost in thought. She'd just gotten out of touch with her readers. That had to be the reason why her own sales were lagging after pushing so hard for 5 long years. She was too busy worrying about the why and had lost sight of the feeling. Being here, away from all the people in the city, might be just what she needed. Life as a hermit had its bonuses. She could work in her pajamas, she could eat ice cream for dinner, and she didn't have to admit to anyone that she was lonely, because there was no one to admit it to. But there was also Danica, who was so like her, but committed to someone else. She'd found someone worthy enough for her to give up the silence. A squealing child ran up to the fence next to her and climbed up, breaking into her thoughts. "Mama, look! Before we go eat, can we go pet one?" Madison's heart squeezed painfully at the interruption, and she backed away. Why did they have to choose this bit of fence in the entire ranch? A woman pushed her from behind as she walked past. "Can't you see I'm trying to get my daughter? No, dear, don't climb in there. Those things might bite." Another child whizzed past her, and that was enough. It was far too inhabited outside. Madison took off in the direction of the barns, not that they would be any quieter. At home, there was always someone in the barn doing something. Her parents worked long, hard hours. Despite what Sarah, of Sarah Plain and Tall fame, said, a barn was not a good place to think. Not for her, anyway. A young couple with gleaming smiles stood next to a saddled horse as a ranch hand took a picture for them. Madison dashed around the happy couple as another few kids played in the hay. She'd never understood children. They were like little aliens to her, and other people's children had taught her that even if she did ever let a man close enough to marry, she'd never want any of her own. They always saw right through her to her weaknesses and fears. Little buggers. She came around to the other end of the barn, and a large sign caught her eye. "No guests pass this door." A pang of guilt momentarily stayed her hand on the door. If no guests were allowed, there might not be anyone in there. She might get a few minutes of peace, then could leave without anyone the wiser. Madison smiled as she shoved it open, revealing the calming, dark interior. After currying, brushing, and grooming him outside, Randall led Maverick into the barn and found his stall. Now, all he had to do was make sure the horse had some feed and water, then he could loose the hot chaps, clean up, and go in for supper. It wouldn't be long now. In the brief time he'd been with Dawson Creek Ranch, he'd learned a few things. Luke and Braden were fair but expected a lot. Braden worked hard and was quiet, and Mrs. Alice was the best cook he'd ever met, though he'd never admit that to his mama. Something shifted behind him and he whipped around, armed only with the curry comb he hadn't put back. Rattlers weren't common in the barn, but it was always a possibility. He practically dropped the comb as he stopped short. Miss Legg sat on a camp chair with the cutest darn you-caught-me look he'd ever seen. She slowly uncurled her long legs from underneath her and tucked her skirt around them. She bit her lip. My lands, she was gorgeous. "I know I'm not supposed to be in here. It's just that there were so many people. Everywhere I went, I'd run into more, and I just wanted a minute alone." She ran out of breath. He took a full minute to realize he was staring and needed to say something. While Legs was much better than a rattler, her presence could still get him into trouble. He made his way over to her slowly. Her wary eyes, the deepest blue he'd ever seen, said she'd bolt at any moment. He held still, worried that any movement at all and she'd be gone. Since he had to work, moments alone should never go to waste. Boy, could he understand her need for peace. The first week he'd been at Dawson Creek Ranch had been hard, people everywhere. He'd had to get used to getting in his alone time in the barn, too. He peeled his leather work glove off and prayed he wasn't too sweaty as he held his hand out to her as a peace offering. She looked at it for a moment, then put her small hand in his and stood. Her skin was just about the softest thing he'd ever felt. She was a little shorter than him, with her head only reaching the bridge of his nose, and her red hair flowed down her back in the most pleasant cascade of curls. "I'll show you another quiet place. You can't be in here, and it's not because we're hiding anything. It's just that there are a lot of kids here this week, and they don't want them just climbing into the stalls. It's a liability." He kept his voice low in the hope he wouldn't spook her, but his rambling made him sound foolish. That wasn't what he wanted her to think either. Earlier, she'd been so hesitant to even look at him. She nodded. Thinking back to when he'd first encountered Miss Legs, he remembered that Miss Obvious had called her Madison. "Madison, right?" She shook her head, and a look of complete confusion swept over her face, before she blinked, then plastered a fake, far too nervous smile in its place. Why would someone as pretty as her be nervous around him? "Yes," she replied, her voice a tad unsure. "I'm surprised you remembered. I'm sure you met many people today." He had, but none quite like her. She had yet to let go of his hand, and he didn't especially want to pull it away, but they had to get out of that barn before Braden discovered she was there. He led her out the back so no one else would see them. Why had he offered her his hand? It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Now if anyone saw them, it would look like they were two lovers off to find a private nook. Just the kind of thing Luke didn't want with all those families looking on. He didn't particularly want to let go, but he also didn't want anyone to see. He glanced over his shoulder at her. A tiny black purse hit her on the hip as she bounced along behind him, trying to keep up with his long stride. He slowed down and stopped, letting her catch up, then took the opportunity to loosen his grip. She glanced down at where their hands joined, and her eyes widened. She dropped his hand like he'd burned her. "I'm sorry, so silly." She closed off from him, shielding her eyes by searching the ground, then yanked her huge sunglasses from her purse. She shoved them onto her face and glanced away. "It's no big thing." He had the strangest urge to raise her chin and take those blasted covers off her eyes so he could see them again. "Hold up, Randall. She's a guest. Off limits." A smile quirked at the edge of her lips as her face angled up to his once again. "So, where is this quiet place you mentioned?" Oh, right. He'd almost forgotten why he was there. Indicating an area not far from them, he started walking again. She fell into step next to him, and her tiny sandaled feet looked so strange next to his heavy boots. Her plum toenails glistened in the sunshine. She even managed to have cute feet. The girl was blessed. They'd gone about 5 minutes up a trail that led to a small river. It wasn't much, but was one of the little streams that kept Dawson Creek Ranch fed with water all season long. It was peaceful, and there was a flat rock and a soft patch of grass to sit on. It was a good spot to think. There were many a night, after it had gotten to be too much stress and he needed quiet, that he'd come down to the riverbank. Little Dawson Creek led to the owner's other ranch, though the two weren't connected. "I normally wouldn't share my spot with others, but you looked like you needed it." He winced. Man, what a horrible line. She'll think I'm picking her up. She bit her lip again and looked up at him, her giant sunglasses hiding most of her face from his curious view. "Thank you. You don't know how much it means to me." Now that he'd gotten her there and billed it as a quiet spot, he couldn't exactly stay, and she hadn't exactly invited him. "Well, I'd best get back. Supper'll be on the table soon. Best not miss it. Mrs. Alice's cooking alone is worth the fee." When had he lost all his sense? Right about the time he'd looked into those blue eyes. He'd have to try to stay away from this one, as much as he didn't want to. She turned and walked ahead toward the little river. "Thanks. I brought some snacks in case I miss any meals. I can find my way back." She looked so lonely standing there with one arm behind her back, holding her elbow. So very vulnerable. "I'll be fine. Thank you, Randall," she murmured over her shoulder, not giving him a single glance. She'd remembered his name. His chest tightened. Women never remembered him, not for long anyway. For the second time in a day, he felt dismissed. But this time, he had a feeling it would be brief.